Welcome back. If there's one thing the Warhammer universe is known for, it's its unique space gothic aesthetic and its awe-inspiring blend of religious reverence, medieval grandeur, and dystopian decay. But this aesthetic isn't just a visual spectacle, it's a metatextual influence of Catholic theming and imagery, which inspires the look and feel of 40k as a series. As Warhammer 40k isn't just a universe of endless war, it's also a work of visual and written storytelling that borrows from the deepest wells of human history to inspire the aesthetics of its factions. This video will be split up into two sections about the Imperium's Catholic influence. The first being from outside of the universe, specifically why this particular aesthetic was chosen for the Imperium of Man, and the second will be about some of the in-universe reasons and examples of Catholic inspiration. Before I continue to the main points of this video, do consider hitting the like and subscribe button, as it really does help in the algorithm and I certainly do need it. But if you don't like the content as well, that's fine too, I'm just glad to have you here. Now, I've stalled this long enough, so let's get into it. With that being said, we can now start off by looking at why the designers of 40k took so much influence from the Catholic Church when designing the Imperium of Man. Put simply, the reason why the Imperium of Man looks the way it does is because Catholic aesthetics are unmatched. Even today, a great number of the most recognizable works of art and architecture have their roots in Catholicism. When we examine the Imperium's monumental structures, grand cathedrals and intricately carved facades, it's not hard to see the unmistakable influence of centuries of Catholic art and architecture. These awe-inspiring edifices were designed not just as places of worship, but as visual testaments to human ambition, divine mystery, and the struggle against earthly transience. In Warhammer 40k, the towering temples, vast vaulted halls, and heavily ornamented citadels directly channel the same intent, to instill a sense of might and sacred purpose in a universe where every structure is as much a fortress as it is a shrine. The designers of the Imperium of Man were drawn to Catholic aesthetics because they evoke a complex mix of emotion. For centuries, Catholic art has masterfully blended beauty with foreboding, light with darkness, and hope with despair. This duality is perfectly mirrored in the Warhammer 40k setting, where even the most elegant cathedrals are set against a backdrop of decay and eternal conflict. The pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and flying buttresses, hallmarks of Gothic architecture, are not merely stylistic choices. They're deliberate symbols of ascension and the yearning to reach beyond the mortal limits of mankind, even as reality itself seems to crumble around them. Catholic aesthetics also embrace the power of ritual. In Catholic tradition, the sensory experience, the incense, regal chants, the somber procession, is central to invoking a deeper spiritual response. The lofty echoing chants of a cathedral's choir, the reverent display of sacred relics, and the elaborate vestments worn by the clergy are designed to inspire both awe and a profound sense of the holy. Warhammer 40k mirrors this by turning the veneration of the Emperor and the performance of the imperial rites into a grand, almost liturgical spectacle. Rituals within the Imperium, be it the blessing of a battle fleet or the consecration of a new shrine, borrow heavily from these Catholic ceremonies, underscoring the vital role that faith and tradition play in the fabric of the Imperium society, even if their society is steeped in perpetual war. There's also a fascinating irony in how the Imperium of Man fuses technologically advanced futuristic elements with ancient, almost timeless Catholic imagery. It creates a weird dissonance in the Imperium, almost as if they're taking one step into the future but one step into the past. The cold metallic surfaces of their advanced war machines contrast sharply with the intricate, ornate details borrowed from centuries-old cathedrals, lending the entire universe an aura of both relentless efficiency and haunted grandeur. Furthermore, this deliberate synthesis of influences is more than just an aesthetic choice. It serves a narrative purpose, be it the triumph of the human spirit or the persistence of hope in the face of overwhelming darkness. Looking beyond that as well, we have to consider that Warhammer 40k itself began as essentially Warhammer fantasy in space. As such, many of the themes of medieval fantasy fiction wormed their way into the series from its inception, albeit the more gothic aesthetic of 40k didn't truly arrive until 3rd edition's grimmer, darker visual style. I want to hone in on the term Gothic as well, as that gets thrown around quite a lot when discussing the aesthetics of the 40k universe. While today we often have a view of Gothic as being a particular style of architecture associated with dark colours and pointy buildings, in truth the term Gothic was devised in Renaissance Italy, really meaning barbarian and referring to any kind of architecture that wasn't classical. Renaissance intellectuals look back on the designs of the Goths as a corrupt deviation from the high ideals of classical architecture. In their eyes, anything that deviated from the ordered beauty of the Greco-Roman form was a symbol of cultural decay. As the Goths, a northern European tribe, were considered to be the people who caused the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and therefore were considered the ones who had essentially destroyed civilization. I'm sure you can see what I'm getting at here. This architectural transition is not merely an accident of design evolution, it's deeply symbolic of the Imperium's own metamorphosis. Early in its history, the designs associated with the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy, a more idealized vision of order, reminiscent of the classical Roman and Greek designs. The transition to a more medieval Gothic style reflected a society striving to rebuild what it had lost in the wake of a great war, and a society aspiring to the zenith of civilization, which it had lost. Now, it's entirely possible that I'm reading too deeply into this and that there is no real subtext to the aesthetic of the Imperium, with Games Workshop merely choosing an aesthetic that matched the medieval fantasy and space universe they were creating. But regardless, I do feel that the overwhelming amount of evidence leads us to believe that this decision was intentional. This mirrors both the collapse of the Western Roman Empire and the particular influences that the Catholic Church's crusades had on martial identity, with the shift from an organized professional army in the classical eras of antiquity turning more into ad hoc organizations of fighters later on in the medieval period. Of course, the general concept of the Imperium's crusades has a heavy medieval influence, but beyond that, whilst doing more research for this video, I found that the aesthetics of Space Marines were far more crusader-orientated than even I expected them to be. A lot of the quotes I found from medieval authors sounded like they could slot into 40k with little to no change. For example, this is a quote by the medieval author Bernard de Clairvaux, specifically on the Knights Templar. Now, I'm fairly confident you could have just removed the word steel and replaced it with ceramite, and no one would bat an eye to hear this being said by a chaplain of the Black Templars chapter. The last point I wanted to make was in regard to the Horus Heresy and its relation to the biblical war in heaven. Now, we cover this partially in the historical influences on each Primarch, specifically in the section corresponding to Sanguinius. Just to reiterate, the war in heaven was an event described in the Bible, wherein Lucifer, one of God's greatest angels, leads several of his brother angels and their armies in rebellion against their creator. Ultimately, the rebel angels are defeated and Lucifer and his lieutenants are cast down to hell. Now, I'm sure that the parallels to the Horus Heresy are blatantly obvious at this point, specifically in regard to Horus being considered one of the Emperor's greatest progeny, only to conspire in rebellion with several other Primarchs against him, ultimately being defeated and having his followers banished to the 40k equivalent of hell. Even further with the biblical scriptures, it's described that the angel who ultimately defeated Lucifer and cast him down was Saint Michael the Archangel. Now, I went into more detail in the video we mentioned before, but Sanguinius derives a lot of his character and story arc from the angels of the Bible. Most prominent influence being the Archangel Michael. You can see this influence in a lot of the official art of Sanguinius, but one of the most direct examples is his Forge World mini, which appears to be directly modelled off depictions of Saint Michael. Michael is ultimately the one who defeats Lucifer and casts him and the rebel angels to hell, much like Sanguinius' battle with Horus on the Vengeful Spirit, although it arguably went better for Michael than it did for Sanguinius. Along with that, with the idea of Christian theology in mind, an army of angels cast down into hell in a war eons ago, coming back to plague the lives of mankind is very 40k. Now, this script is already getting rather long, and in truth, there's quite a lot more we could go over on the out-of-universe influences of Catholicism, on the art and aesthetics of 40k, which would fill several videos in of themselves, discussing how the Mechanicus' tech rituals and liturgical practices align almost one-to-one with Catholic theology and practices. But in the interest of time, we'll move on to the second portion of the video, and that is how Catholicism, or Christianity in general, exists or existed within the world of Warhammer. Being that the setting takes place in the far future of what is ostensibly our Milky Way galaxy, it would logically make sense that Christianity existed in some form, either during the Old Night or during the nascent Imperium itself. We know for almost certainty that Christianity, and Catholicism specifically, was one of the last surviving religions from Old Earth, having survived the Age of Strife and Dark Age of Technology on Terra. Though it must be said that by the time of the Unification Wars, the overall concept of Christianity had devolved to a point where it only vaguely resembled what we have today. with even the word referring to the religion being a corruption of the term Catholic. By the time of the Great Crusade, it was referred to as Catharism, and its adherents being called Catheric. The basic ideas of Catholic or Catheric belief are also understood by a number of characters within 40k. Sanguinius and Guilliman specifically make references to it on multiple occasions, citing the concepts like hell and the demonic, while other characters like Marines of the Great Crusade and Horus Heresy appear to have some vague understanding of it as an ancient Terran myth. Arguably the person with the most knowledge regarding Catharism, barring the Emperor of Mankind himself, was Magnus, as the most information we really get on Catheric belief comes from the novel Prospero Burns, where we learn that by the time of the Unification Wars, its followers worshipped a singular god, symbolized by the crux, a metallic cross worn over the chest, and adhered to a doctrine collectively known as Catharism. Even as the Age of Strife plunged Terra into war and darkness, pockets of Catheric faithful maintained secret shrines and processions of smoke-filled censers, clinging to what they felt was an unbroken lineage of worship. Central to Catheric practice was its morality and its ritual calendar, as we know that worshippers carried smoke-filled censers in solemn processions, echoing the medieval Catholic Church's liturgies, and observed feasts and festivals such as Cathermass, Radmastide, and the Festival of the Divine Architect. Catheric theology was one that was based on a millenarian prophecy, that Terra would one day suffer a final apocalypse, yet a savior would emerge to redeem the righteous and reshape society. When the Age of Strife yielded no deliverance, many of the Catheric faithful wrestled with theological dissonance, and some philosophers argued that humanity's sins had grown so monstrous that they must atone first through suffering before divine grace could manifest. As the Emperor consolidated power across Terra, his victories and reforms led to worshippers to perceive him not just as a savior, but as a god. Despite his personal denials, religious devotion coalesced around the imperial figures, driving other faiths to near extinction along with their gods. Catharism alone escaped the total eclipse of all other faiths, and its adherents embarked on an ambitious project specifically to rebuild what would be a monumental city on Old Terra meant to embody their faith and Terra's rebirth. Yet, after over a century of construction and more than 40 standard years into the Great Crusade, it's believed that raiders destroyed the Catheric work camps and was largely abandoned and its promise left unfulfilled. Even 20 years before the heresy began, Catheric worship persisted, though often undercover. One individual, Caspar Horser, raised in communes, openly retained respect for Catheric morality, despite his personal doubt about the divine, and another individual, Navid Mirza, concealed his crux behind dark robes, mocking public displays of faith either in Catharism or the Emperor, even though he privately sought solace in the divine. The most well-known Catheric person being, of course, Olennius Pearson, the perpetual and veteran of the Great Crusade, who settled on Cowth so he could openly wear his crux among the frontier worlds who were more tolerant of his ancient Terran traditions. Ultimately, this is likely the in-lore explanation for the reason why the Imperium looks the way it does. As well, the Great Crusade and the Emperor's vision was ultimately for a humanity without religion. In the wake of his death and the establishment of the ecclesiarchy, it's likely due to the fact that no other religious system survived as long as Catharism or was as prevalent after the Horus Heresy, meaning that for the new imperial cult to form, they had to establish themselves using aspects of the only other prominent human religion in existence by then. With this slowly spreading to other areas of the Imperium, like the shift of the crux from a symbol of Catharism to one associated with the Astartes, like the Crux Terminatus of Space Marine Terminator armor. With the loss of many pre-existing religions in the wake of the Imperium's rise, the newly established imperial cult had to essentially default to using the aesthetics and practices present in the only other human religion. Now, it's fairly obvious that the link between the imperial cult and Catharism was a far later invention outside of the universe, created more as an in-world justification for the designer's choice in visuals, rather than a pre-planned story reason. So while the imperial cult's resemblance to ancient human religions like Catharism may seem intentional, it's more likely an artifact of visual and thematic choices made by the designers, woven back into the story as part of the tapestry of 40k lore. That is part of the beauty and complexity of world building in a long-running fictional universe like 40k. Sometimes it starts with ideas and symbols that evoke a certain feeling or tone, and only later are these elements given narrative weight. In the case of the Imperial cult, what began simply as Gothic religious aesthetics reminiscent of Earth's own history was later rationalized within the lore as the default spiritual framework after the fall of the Emperor and the rise of the ecclesiarchy, when few surviving religions remained after the Horus Heresy, and the new Imperial faith had to build itself on something recognizable. But beyond that, there's not much more to get into, and with the interest of this video not being any longer than it actually is, I'll leave it there. If you did enjoy this video, feel free to subscribe, and if you didn't, feel free to dislike. And with that in mind, there's nothing else for me to say, so have a wonderful rest of your day.